لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله.
الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وآله وصحبه أجمعين. So, inshallah, I understand that many of you or some of you have been part of the STEPS program, which is kind of, I think, a incremental program for students of knowledge or talabat al-ilm. So there's a couple things I want to share with you in the time that we have. One of those things is, first of all, to congratulate you on your decision to set out on a path of knowledge. That is a very noble thing to do. It's an essential thing to do, especially when we are surrounded by a lot of misdirection and indecision and trepidation, anxiety about many things. And really, all of that comes under the general term of ignorance. And the only way to really counter ignorance is with knowledge. And it has been the premise of our teachers, as we learned from them over the past 20 years or so, and we've heard it repeatedly, that really the most important part in terms of for the community, for the ummah to kind of get a sure footing or regain its footing, it has to begin with talab al-ilm, with seeking knowledge. And one of the beautiful things about our deen is that the knowledge is preserved, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised us that He will continue to preserve it until the last days. إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. We have sent down the dhikr. Yes, the exegetes of the Quran said the dhikr here means the Quran, but that actually also means everything that is ancillary to understanding the Quran. So we can't really properly understand the Quran without the Sunnah, right? Because the Sunnah, it's not merely just a second source, but it's actually an explication of how do we go about living the meanings of the Quran. And we can't properly understand the meanings of the Sunnah unless we have a sound methodology by which we can understand the Sunnah. Because the Sunnah is transmitted initially via the person of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Since the Prophet ﷺ is no longer with us, at least in his earthly form, then that means there has to be a methodology by which we can understand that. And the only way that can be done is by what's called transmission. Our ulama, our tradition, however, has come up with a better word than transmission. They called it isnad. Very famously, Abdullah ibn Mubarak and perhaps al-Hasan al-Basri before him said that al-isnadu min ad-din wa lawla al-isnad laqala man sha' ma sha'. Isnad is from the deen. In other words, sound authoritative transmission is from the deen, because it's actually the method by which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has chosen for the deen to be preserved. You know, one of the things that we certainly know is, though the revelation first was revealed in Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, that didn't happen happenstance. That wasn't by accident. There are reasons why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose the Arabian Peninsula for the revelation to be revealed. And one of those reasons is that the Arabs who were there already had sort of already a rudimentary form or method of isnad, or they had the concept of sanad. They were a largely unlettered society. In other words, they didn't really read or write. They didn't have a very strong written tradition, but they had extremely sophisticated and strong oral tradition. And the initial method by which this deen has been transmitted via isnad and preserved has been largely by the oral tradition. One of the things that Islamicists, they call themselves Islamicists today, but we used to call them Orientalists. One of the things they try to do is sow doubt in the transmission of the deen from the early period. And one of the things that they usually try to pick on is, where is the written, authoritative kind of copy of the Quran, for example? Why was the hadith not actually written down, which is erroneous? It was written down even in the early period, but let's just say for argument's sake. They said, why was the hadith not written down or formally compiled until 150 years after the hijrah of the Prophet ﷺ? So they feel, because based upon their Western tradition, right, which didn't really have as strong as oral tradition, we can argue, as was in the Arabian Peninsula, in the absence then of a written tradition, then they want to say that it's illegitimate. But just because you're not familiar with something and you don't have something like it in your own tradition doesn't mean that it's not viable. So the very strong written oral tradition in the Arabian Peninsula is what preserved, right, and what transmitted the Quran, what transmitted the hadith, what transmitted also al-amal, the actual way about how to go about doing things. Right? Al-Medina itself was sort of an incubator for the amal, for how the sunnah was going to be practiced, right, in the early generations, obviously from the generation of the Prophet ﷺ and even generations thereafter. So all of that was very meticulously recorded. We are probably the only tradition that I'm aware of where we have recorded what others would consider to be minutia, right, like really small details, like the length of the Prophet ﷺ's eyelashes, right, to things that were even, how many units of prayer, rak'ah in the subh prayer, and how long is the distance for travel, and so forth. All of these things have been recorded in very good detail. So even the way the Prophet ﷺ, what he looked like, Anas ibn Malik records for us in the Shama'il al-Tirmidhi what his hand felt like to touch, right? And he said he didn't touch silk that was as fine as the hand of the Prophet ﷺ. And in the same hadith, he also mentions in one version that he did not pray a prayer behind someone as light and as complete, la akhaf wa la atam, as light or as complete than the prayer of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So it's almost like they take you back in time with them. So it's not just what they saw and what they heard, but it's also what they felt. And I'm not aware of any other tradition, historical tradition, that has that kind of level of, detail and kind of bringing you and putting you in the environment, the realm of what they lived. And this is 1,400 years ago, 1,500 years ago. So that needs a system, right, by which we can access it. And that system has to be one that's living and breathing, right? We use the word tradition in the sense that tradition is only going to be useful for you if it doesn't just inform you about the past, but also informs your present and your future going forward. If it doesn't do that, then it's an ossified tradition, and it's something that's, like you go into a forest with dead trees, and the bark is kind of scraping off, and the tree is no longer viable, but you can tell that there used to be something there. That's not what our tradition is. Our tradition is you go into the live forest. You go into the redwood forest in California, and you can tell by the number of rings and how big they are that these trees have been here for decades, if not some of them a century or more. But it's still living, right? It's still giving. So our past informs our present. And it takes people who are well versed and imbued with the Sunnah and the tradition of the Prophet ﷺ in order to say, this is the practice of it now. This is how we live it today. And for that reason, we cannot merely rely on what's called the textual transmission, which has been many people have fallen into error and folly because they assume that that would be sufficient. Which means, oh, we have the Quran, I can read the Quran, I have the Sunnah, I have the Hadith, I can go on to Google and look up any Hadith by number or by word, and it will come right up. So it doesn't seem like we need this whole Seekers Hub and all this stuff that we're doing here. We can just sit at home and read the stuff on our own, and just like we read a recipe to make samosas and pakoras and stuff like that, why can't we do that with the deen? And the problem is that the text itself is not sufficient. And in fact, when the text is accessed, but not via the living, breathing ulama who are going to give us full access to the text in the manner that we should have it, then the text actually becomes something that could be detrimental and even destructive more than productive, right? The Quran especially is of the nature that it's going to, the way that you interpret it is going to reflect what's already inside you. And so if there's disease, there's corruption, there are second agendas and so forth, then you're going to read in it what you want to read into it. And you have to go to the Quran with an empty cup. You have to go and let it fill you up, and not you manipulate it in the way that you want. So many of the groups, the extremist groups and other groups, some of them not even violent, but even very exceptional in the way that they understand Islam, have gone this way. They have been driven by political considerations or tribal considerations and so forth, and so they go into it kind of looking, to see how they can justify what they want to be doing anyway. And the deen doesn't work like that. You have to come to it and let it fill you up rather than you try to manipulate it, because then it becomes the opposite of what it's meant to be. So that's why it's important to have people who are fully invested in this concept of isnad, right? And isnad means that there is a living sort of tradition in addition to the text. So it's not just the Quran, not just the Sunnah, but how we go about understanding and interpreting it, and how we go about practicing it. And then there are living, breathing examples of how to go about doing that. And due to the rich diversity and humanity, you can say there's also a rich diversity in the tradition. So while we have an overarching tradition of Islam, within it there are many intellectual traditions that kind of also developed and had their own practitioners and had some of their own methodologies and so forth. So the fiqh tradition, for example, developed, and even within the fiqh tradition there's at least 4 different strands, right? 4 different kind of schools of thought. And the Maliki school, for example, developed quite differently than the Hanafi school did or the Shafi'i school did. There were things that happened that were both historical and socio-cultural in nature that influenced the trajectory of how each madhab developed. And that's due to diversity of people and diversity of geography. And all of that breadth and that width is a blessing, right? It's a khabar, it may not be hadith sahih, but it's a true khabar in terms of the meaning. اختلاف أمتي رحمة, right? So these differences, the diversity, so I wouldn't say the differences, I would say the diversity within the ummah is a source of blessing and mercy for the ummah. We don't all have to be exactly the same. So uniformity does not equal equality. We don't have to be uniform, right? In other words, we're all exactly the same. We can recognize that there are differences, and that even different understandings of even the same hadith, for example, can lead to a rich difference that's complementary and doesn't have to be contradictory. And anyone who tries to make the case otherwise, we all have to be exactly uniform, and otherwise the difference will be something that is going to be detrimental to us, That's a very kind of modern notion. Modernity seeks to uniformize everything, right? It wants to make everything like a cookie cutter type of existence. You know, you look at newer housing developments today, and all the houses look the same. You go to very old neighborhoods from probably at least 50, 60, 70 years ago, where some of these neighborhoods are still kind of preserved, and none of the houses look the same. A lot of them look different than one another. There's kind of a uniqueness to each one of them. And, you know, this modernizing trend lends towards uniformity because it's generally easier to subdue and to manipulate something when they're all the same, rather than you have to deal with diversity. So, you know, one of the things when you first start trying to learn is you get an appreciation for how little you actually know. And whether you've been at it for 1 month or 20 or 30 years, you'll come to that same conclusion consistently. Because no matter how much you think you know, you're always going to feel like, whoa, there's this whole other that I don't know. So it is a lifelong commitment, as it were, because if we are talking about at least knowledge of the divine, knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot be circumscribed or limited in any way, so it's an infinite amount that we can, in terms of describing Allah, then it's an infinite amount that we can know about Him. So there's always going to be a taraqqi, there's always going to be, inshallah, raising of understanding and raising in degrees in terms of the level of our understanding. In terms of practical advice, one of the things that I would recommend is to take things at a moderate pace. There's no reason to try to rush. It's really about you being in the process of it rather than how much have I accumulated. Right? Imam Malik very famously said, ليس العلم بكثرة الرواية إنما هو نور يقذفه الله في القلب. That knowledge is not how many hadith or how many narrations you can acquire and accumulate, but it's a light that can be, or that a light that is cast into the hearts. And it's interesting, if you look to the way that they did their hadith compilations, and generally speaking, Imam Malik is credited with having the first really compilation of hadith, Kitab al-Muwatta. Bukhari and Muslim were decades after him, but he's generally credited with kind of doing the first musannaf, or in terms of ordered book of hadith. And one of the things that's been narrated by Al-Qadi Iyad and others is the Muwatta today is probably something along the lines of about 500 hadith or so, not excluding the Muqarrar if there's any repeats. But at a time, some of the narrations indicate that it was thousands of hadith, maybe up to 40,000 hadith. So it's not like Imam Malik didn't have access to what was circulating at the time, probably something in the neighborhood of several 100,000 hadith. But, you know, what he was trying to do is present to the talabat al-ilm and present to the ummah the soundest, right, and the best approach to understanding the sunnah despite all of the data, right? So it's not unlike, I think, what people talk today about, people are in tech and things like that, some may be familiar with it, the idea of big data, that today the amount of data or information that is collected is astronomical, right? You'd need gigabytes upon gigabytes to store everything, you know, even the amount of data that each of us produce in one day in terms of our internet activities and social media and so forth, it's a lot, and photos to store all of this. And so what marketing companies talk about today is not so much about capturing the data, they have all the data, but how do you understand the data? You know, the next big thing will be the algorithms that are going to be able to sift through all of that and make some meaning of it. And this was a process, I think, not unlike what the muhaddithun were doing early on. So they had access to a lot of hadith. And even al-Bukhari, his number of hadith, including the Muqarrar, is like 7,300 or so. he also knew a million hadith, right? Somewhere along the lines of a million hadith that he may have had access to, but he only included those that he thought would be the most relevant and the most indicative. Now, obviously, in terms of content, when they say multiple hadith, if it has a different sanad, if it had different narrators, even though the content is the same, they consider it two different hadith. So it's not like, there's a whole lot of content that we're missing, but they're actually sifting and looking at the best chains of transmission. And so they wanted to find also the soundest asanid, right? Because as we said, al-isnadu min ad-din. So part of finding the soundest asanid, well, the isnad is made up of individuals, it's narrators. So looking at the soundest people who narrate, well, what do they look for in the narrator? Two main attributes, ad-dabt wal-adala, precision and trustworthiness. And in today's parlance, we can say it's about skills and competence and honesty. Anytime you want someone to assist you with something, whether it's a small job, whether it's to mow your lawn, or to watch your house, or to be your digital marketer, or to be your physician, these are the two things we look for. Almost, without thinking about it. We want to know that they're competent, right? That they have the skills, they know what they're doing, and at the same time, we want to know that we can trust them. So not just trusting their skills, but trusting them as a person. There's a level of trustworthiness. They're not going to try to swindle us. They're not going to try to betray us or deceive us. And this is what, in terms of how we approach the deen, it's also the same way. And we find examples of this in the Quran too. Right? When Al-Aziz offered Sayyidina Yusuf any of the, what we would call cabinet positions at the time, ministries at the time, he said, اجعلني على خزائن الأرض إني حفيظ عليم. Give me the treasury. إني حفيظ عليم. Right? حفيظ من الحفظ, right? Trustworthy, and alim, and knowledgeable. As I have the skills, I know how to manage the Ministry of Treasury. I'm not going to have the skills to do it, and at the same time, I'm not going to swindle anybody. I'm not going to deceive anybody with it. When the daughter of Shu'aib, after Musa alayhi salam took their animals to drink from the well because there were men in the way, and then the conversation began, and then she said, يا بيت استأجر إن خير من استأجرت القوي الأمين. Father, we need help raising our farm and so forth. استأجره, see if he's willing to work for you. إن خير من استأجرت القوي الأمين. The best of those that you can seek are القوي والأمين, the strong and the trustworthy. So القوة also is another word for competence in that particular in that particular environment, and al-amin, right, the one who is trustworthy. So when we seek knowledge, we also should look for those two attributes. The ulama have said that knowledge cannot fully take place except if you have four things. You have kutubun sihah, sound books, right? There are many, many books that were written, but we want the soundest of books. وَعَقْلٌ رَجَّاحٌ, and sound intellect. You have to have a level of intelligence. And Shaykhun Fattah, and a Shaykh or a teacher who's well versed. Fattah he has openings or she has openings, and they're going to bring you openings. وَمُدَاوَمَةٌ وَإِلْحَاحٌ, and persistence. العلم لا يؤتيك بعضه حتى تؤتيه كلك. Knowledge will not give you some of what she has unless you give it your all. And they also say أبى العلم أن يكون إلا لله. And knowledge refuses to be for the sake of anything except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they understand that in two ways. One way is that if you start off and you're seeking it for other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you're seeking it so that you can show off your muscles in the masjid for the people who, keep arguing with you that 20 rak'ahs in Tarawih is bid'ah, and you kind of just want to shut them down. So you want to seek knowledge, to slap anybody down who's going to get in your way, then that's not for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's for you. That's for your ego. So you won't really learn anything. That's one interpretation. A kinder interpretation is, well, you may start off that way, but if you're really seeking it, it's going to change you. And so, even though your intention was not the best at the outset, knowledge necessarily then is going to mold you into what you should be, and then you'll make the turn in direction that you should, in order to avail yourself of the knowledge, and then be someone who is not just a recipient of knowledge, but someone who actually can now disseminate it too. So not just a recipient of the light, so not just the light has been cast upon you and you could see that they're enlightened, but it also has the ability now to reflect the light to others. And that's what the idea of knowledge is supposed to be. Ilmun nafi', knowledge that is beneficial. وَنَعُوذُ بِكَ مِنْ عِلْمٍ لَا يَنْفَعُ. There's knowledge that's not beneficial. And we seek refuge with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from knowledge that's not going to be beneficial. So we seek the best of knowledge, and via those four things: sound books, good teachers, sound intellect, and persistence and resolve. If you have those four things, and they're all necessary conditions, then the transmission of knowledge will take place. And then the practice of the deen will take place. And then that will in turn lead to sound Muslims, sound families, sound communities, and sound nations after that. But it has to begin with knowledge, seeking it, and practicing in the best way that one can avail themselves of. Should we leave time for questions, or what do you think? We got about 15 minutes. Yeah, I think that's... Yeah. If anyone has any questions, or if there's people online. Yes, Sigam.
You mentioned that with the Quran one has to come with an empty cup, so because the Quran reflects the internal states. To what extent should one approach knowledge, and of course the Quran first and foremost, to what extent should one strive to have that clear cup, given that it's almost like a lifetime of or it takes a very long time to reach a totally clear cup?
Well, I think another way to phrase it is, we have to come without any without unnecessary baggage, which means we have to come with an attitude of what they call taslim. In other words, I have to acquiesce and say, you know what, I heard that, but it's not sitting well with me. I don't know if I want to believe in that or not, because it's challenging my worldview. And that notion means you didn't quite come with an empty cup. It means that you are kind of holding on to some things, that obviously we are all products of our environment and of our education, our secular education, our conditioning, and a lot of that is going to it's not going to be reconcilable, to be honest with you, with a lot of what we learn, especially from a methodological basis with the deen. For example, the deen, there is a concept of hierarchy, and there is a concept of darajat, and people being in higher up in a hierarchy, not based upon something that they necessarily inherited in terms of language or race or class or anything like that, but based upon taqwa, based upon knowledge. And most traditional societies have this hierarchical approach. Modern society wants to completely do away with hierarchy, all right? And I think in the vain attempt to say that, well, we are all equal, and so that means at the same time that we should all have an absolute equality in even what we think about things and the way that we see things. And that just doesn't work in real life. When I get on an airplane, I don't want to take a vote about who drives the plane. I want the pilot to be the one flying the plane because he's the one or she's the one who knows how to fly the plane. And I don't want to leave it up to a vote between the passengers because we should all have equal access to flying the plane. And that sounds ridiculous, but that's actually what people say about religion too. That's what people say about the deen. Just because you are someone who thinks you should be a spokesperson for Islam, or you had this particular experience or background or so forth, and now you feel that you are in a position to start talking about what Islam is and what it isn't and what it should do and what it should not do, and that sort of thing. There are well-known, trained routes by which we access it. It's not a mistake. Imam Malik called his book Al-Muwatta. It comes from the word watta'a, which means to tread often over something. So the Muwatta is then the well-trodden path. What does he mean by that? Who are the ones who trotted over this path? Well, he said about himself, I didn't sit down. He wasn't vainglorious like me and sat here in front of you. Before he said 700 of my teachers gave me ijazah, gave me permission to do so. Because he wants to be on a well-trodden path, right? He wants to be the path that the more eyes that have been on it, right, the more hands that have touched it, the more hearts that have been a part of it, then the sounder it is. And today we celebrate the exceptional. We celebrate the rebel. It's been glorified and celebrated in movies and in popular culture, and people who go against inherited wisdom and go against inherited tradition, right? And they're the ones at the end of the day who are the heroes, right? The person who can come out of nowhere and had no training and wasn't even part of that inherited tradition, but they're so, just because of their own individual gumption, they're able to be the ones who save the day. And you see it repeatedly in the movies, right? In Avatar, the army guy who's not one of the indigenous natives on that planet, he's the one who saves the day, and he's the one who knows how to slay the dragon, and he's the one who, can do all those things. There's a lot of white savior thing in that too, but at the same time, the idea is if you can go against tradition, the shackles of it. And even the modern educational system is predicated on this. Weber and others, their idea was that the child should be educated so that they can be autonomous or have a sense of autonomy, which means that they do and think independently outside of any inherited tradition from their parents or their culture. Because then that would build the best, not man, not woman, not individual, but the best citizen, the best worker, which is quite different than the best human being. So we've been conditioned a lot of these things, and it takes, I think, a process of, what do you call it, deconditioning maybe or something, in order to kind of get out of that. And so one of the things that's going to be challenging in the beginning is to submit yourself to really a whole different way of looking at things. So that's what I mean by empty cup. You have to come in and just listen a lot and silence your inner objections to a degree. And I know that runs contrary to conventional wisdom, because we're always supposed to listen to our inner voice, right? But when your inner voice is an infantile child, because it hasn't been, I'm sorry to use words like that, but that's where we're at, If it's an infant and he keeps yelling and screaming and, because he wants playtime and you're trying to be serious, then, that is a type of inner voice you want to silence to some degree until, it gets disciplined When do you listen to your inner voice? When it's a disciplined inner voice. Right? When the Prophet ﷺ said to Walsib, "Istafti qalbak wa in aftaka an-nas," he's saying it to him. He didn't mean it for everybody, right? Seek your inner voice, istafti qalbak, listen to your heart, and even if other people give you opinions. But that means you're in a place where you're ready to do that. Not if you have the inner infant that's the one who's telling you what to do. But if it's the inner, refined savant, then yeah, I would listen to that inner voice. But short of that, that's a process that takes time. So you have to do a lot of taslim, a lot of acquiescence. And I don't mean to say, sometimes you may hear things from a teacher, maybe they are outlandish, maybe they're wrong. None of us are infallible, we can make mistakes, and it's perfectly legitimate to do muraja'ah. So even if you are going to say, you know what, I didn't quite understand that, let the intention be that you didn't quite understand that, and that you're not testing the individual, you're not testing the teacher, or you're not trying to kind of get them to make a slip up and see if they really know their stuff or not, but you're actually genuinely interested in understanding this thing that you don't quite understand. That's encouraged, right? They say that لا ينال العلم مستحي ولا مستكبر, that the one who is too shy or the one who's too arrogant, they won't learn. Because the one who's too arrogant thinks they don't need to learn anything, so they're not willing to listen to anybody. And the one who's too shy is too afraid to ask. So don't be afraid to ask, but have tasih an-niyyah, have the right intention behind why you're asking. And also, rise to the level where maybe even the teacher might misinterpret your intention for asking the question, and maybe they're going to be a little bit short with you. Even be patient with that, right? Because no one who sits up here is perfect. And they have their own mistakes, and they have their own struggles, and all of that, just like everybody else. So try to leave some allotment for this. Like, okay, they can be in a bad mood just like everybody else, and then they can say something short or say something out of turn and that type of thing. And don't let that discourage you from continuing the learning process. Okay.
You mentioned that textualism is insufficient to understand the tradition.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be connected to the living, breathing tradition of the scholars.
Mm-hmm.
And you also mentioned that Medina was an incubator for the amal, like the living tradition of the Sunnah. This was addressed differently by different scholars over time. I was wondering if you
I wasn't specifically talking about Amal Ahl al-Medina and the Maliki school. I was speaking more in a general sense. Because there's no question that the companions who were with the Prophet ﷺ, whether they chose to stay in Medina, as some did, after his death, ﷺ, or they chose to leave and go to Kufa and go to Damascus and go to other places, still they carried that with them. But where did it all begin? Al-Medina. So the Medina then was kind of that first functioning community where these things were put into practice. So, I'm not specifically talking about post-prophetic Medinian traditions, but that's scholarly debate. But I'm talking about it more in a general sense. Does that clear up your question? Any of the sisters have any questions? You can write them down too if you don't want to. طيب. Jazakumullah khair. I hope there was some benefit to this session. I'll be around the rest of this evening and tomorrow, so if anyone has something they want to ask me about, I'm more than happy to try to answer them. Jazakumullah khair.